Welcome to Sleepy Centuries. Tonight, we'll be traveling far, far back, through the quiet mists of time, to a world long before cities, long before humans, even long before flowers. Tonight, we'll be talking about the rise and fall of the dinosaurs, a tale stretching across hundreds of millions of years. But before we begin, take a moment to settle in. Rest your head, close your eyes, and let your breathing slow. Where in the world are you listening from? Whether you're drifting off under northern stars or curled up in the warmth of the southern night, you're safe here. Let your imagination wander. Let's begin. Imagine a world so silent, so empty, that even the wind seems uncertain of its place. No birdsong, no rustling leaves, no animal calls, just the hush of a planet newly born. The Earth, 4.5 billion years ago, was a place of fire and chaos, a glowing sphere, wrapped in smoke and ash, hammered by meteors, its surface a restless sea of lava and storms. But slowly, over vast stretches of time that stretch far beyond our ability to truly grasp, that chaos began to settle. The earth cooled. Rains fell for the first time in centuries, forming great oceans that steamed and hissed over hot rock. Lightning sparked across the sky, and in those primordial waters, something miraculous stirred life, fragile and small, barely more than a whisper, but life nonetheless. In the beginning, there were no giants, no roars, no movement on land, just tiny, single-celled organisms floating in warm, mineral-rich seas, drifting in and out of the currents like specks of dust. They did not think, they did not hunt. They simply existed, multiplying slowly, feeding on sunlight or chemicals in the water. Time passed millions upon millions of years, and with it came change. These tiny life forms began to evolve, to split into new forms. Some clumped together, forming colonies. Others developed more complex structures, laying the foundations for everything that would follow. Life became more than survival. It became possibility. As the earth turned and the sun rose and fell across unrecognizable skies, strange creatures began to take shape in the ocean's soft-bodied swimmers, ribbon-like things with no eyes, no skeletons, just patterns of motion in the dark. Then, in a burst of creativity known as the Cambrian explosion, life exploded into complexity. The seas filled with trilobites crawling across the sea floor, with early fish that darted like shadows through kelp forests, with spiny, tentacled predators that hunted with alien precision. The oceans were vibrant, mysterious, alive, but the land, the great silent continents of stone and dust, remained untouched. Eventually, the silence broke. Green algae began to spread across damp shorelines, clinging to rock and soil. They were followed by mosses, then by the first true plant slough, creeping ferns and horsetails that spread through marshes and riverbanks. As plants transformed the landscape, the air itself began to change. Oxygen levels rose. The sky grew clearer. With more energy in the system, life took bolder steps. Strange, jointed insects began to scuttle across the ground. Giant dragonflies with wingspans longer than your arm buzzed through humid forests. And then came the first vertebrates to walk on land, amphibian-like creatures, emerging from the water to explore a new world under gravity's pull. Still, the earth remained unstable. Continents crashed and split. Volcanoes erupted, covering entire regions in lava. Ice ages came and went, freezing oceans and burying landscapes under snow. And yet, life held on, always adapting, always evolving. Forests of towering tree ferns and club mosses blanketed the land, breathing in the carbon-rich air and exhaling the oxygen that would allow future giants to rise. The Carboniferous period was a green, dense, tangled world where the air was thick, the swamps endless, and the night echoed with the sound of creatures moving through the underbrush. Some of these early creatures began to change in subtle ways. Their limbs grew stronger, better suited to life, away from the water. Their skin thickened to keep moisture in. Lungs improved. These changes were small at first, barely noticeable, but they added up. Over time, the descendants of those swamp-dwelling amphibians became something new: reptiles. They laid eggs with shells, allowing their young to develop safely on dry land. This simple innovation would change the course of life on Earth. Now, creatures could move freely across the continents, untethered from the need to return to water to reproduce. They spread far and wide, adapting to deserts, forests, and plains. The world turned again, and once more, extinction loomed. The end of the Permian period brought the greatest mass extinction in Earth's history. It was a time of fire and suffocation, when over 90% of all life vanished. Entire branches of the tree of life were snuffed out. The air grew still again. Silence returned to land and sea. But in that silence, seeds of change waited. Out of the ashes of extinction came opportunity. A new age was beginning. One where a particular group of reptilesmal, agile, and warm-blooded would take their first steps onto a path that would one day lead to titanic herds, to winged beasts of the skies, to toothy monarchs of the forest. The age of dinosaurs was about to dawn. It began quietly, as so many monumental stories do not with thunder or spectacle, but with shadows slipping between ferns in the warmth of the Triassic sun. The world had been reshaped by disaster. The Permian extinction, devastating and total, had cleared the stage. Where once teeming ecosystems had thrived, now there were only echoes. But nature abhors emptiness. Life, resilient and undeterred, returned to fill the silence. And among the survivors were creatures that did not look like kings. Not yet. Small, quick-footed reptiles, lean and alert, slipped through the undergrowth and hunted insects under the low canopy. They lived in a world still reeling from catastrophe, a planet covered in deserts, scrublands, and patchy forests, where life was rebuilding itself from scraps. The landmass of Earth was united into a single supercontinent, Pangaea, vast, dry expanse, ringed by ocean, and dotted with volcanoes that painted the skies red with ash. The creatures of this early age were diverse, strange, and often alien to our eyes. Crocodile-like beasts with long limbs chased prey through the brush. Some early relatives of mammals, covered in bristled skin and sharp teeth, hunted in packs and cared for their young. Others were enormous amphibians, bloated and slow, who lurked in shallow waters and breathed through skin. Yet among them, nearly unnoticed at first, were the first true dinosaur, small, upright reptiles with long tails for balance, swift legs for running, and sharp, serrated teeth for catching prey. They were not the giants of later ages. Most were no larger than a dog, but they were different. Their hips were rotated beneath their bodies, giving them a more upright stance. Their movements were nimble, fast, precise. They were built for change. These early dinosaurs lived in a world of extremes. Days were hot and dry. Nights could be freezing. Rain was rare. Plants were tough and sparse. Yet, even in such an unforgiving world, life found a rhythm. Primitive conifers and cycads clung to rocky soil. Rivers snaked across the landscape, giving birth to brief oases of life. And in these places, dinosaurs began to thrive. Eoraptor, one of the earliest known, ran through the underbrush of South America on two slender legs, quick and alert. It was a generalist and opportunist. Its sharp teeth could handle meat, but it could survive on plants too. It was flexible, adaptable, light. Another, Herrerasaurus, a more advanced predator, patrolled its hunting grounds with a sharper bite and keener senses. Their bones tell us that they were lean, strong, and efficient. Evolution was sculpting them into something formidable. Still, dinosaurs were not yet rulers. They shared the world with many other reptiles who held the upper hand. Archosaurs, the ancestors of both crocodiles and birds, dominated the Triassic ecosystem. Some walked on 4 legs, others on 2. Many had armor or long jaws for fishing. The competition was fierce, but while others clung to familiar forms and behaviors, the dinosaurs changed. They grew lighter, faster, more specialized. Their lungs became more efficient. Their bones became hollow, allowing for better movement and speed. Slowly, silently, they were preparing for dominance. Meanwhile, the Earth itself was shifting. Tectonic plates stirred beneath the surface, pulling the supercontinent apart. Rifts formed, seas invaded, climates changed. What was once a single massive landmass began to fracture, creating new coasts, new climates, new challenges. Volcanic activity surged, releasing clouds of gas and ash into the atmosphere. Temperatures swung wildly. Many species couldn't adapt. One by one, the dominant reptiles of the Triassic began to disappear. Whether by slow decline or sudden extinction, their era was ending. And so, as night falls on the Triassic world and the stars wheel above a reshaped sky, a quiet transition unfolds. The small, the quick, the adaptable, those who could change with the world survive. The early dinosaurs, once fringe players in the great drama of life, find themselves in a world that suddenly belongs to them. Their time had come, not in an explosion, but in a whisper, a shift in balance, a passing of the torch. What had started as a scattered lineage of unremarkable reptiles was about to become something extraordinary. The Earth was ready for new rulers, and the dinosaurs, patient and persistent, were ready to rise. The world had changed. The Triassic had ended in fire and shadow, with great volcanic eruptions and slow, creeping extinction clearing the path once more. What emerged was a planet reborner, lusher, greener, wetter Earth. As the Jurassic period unfolded, life burst forth with renewed vigor. The continents, still drifting from the great breakup of Pangaea, created new coastlines and climates. The air was thick with moisture, and where once deserts had stretched wide and dry, now jungles and dense forests took root. Rain fell more often, feeding rivers that snaked through fertile valleys and flooded lowlands. The Earth grew warmer, wetter, and more alive than it had been for millions of years. In this transformed world, the dinosaurs did not just survive, they flourished. They grew, they changed, they climbed toward majesty. No longer just nimble predators darting through the shadows, the dinosaurs of the Jurassic were giants in both form and number. Herds of long-necked sauropods moved across the open floodplains like living towers, their heads swaying above the treetops. Species like Brachiosaurus, towering and slow-moving, reached into the canopy with elongated necks, plucking leaves and ferns in lazy, sweeping motions. Diplodocus, with its impossibly long tail and neck, grazed closer to the ground, sweeping across the land in massive groups, their movements stirring clouds of insects and dust. They were too large for most predators to challenge, and their size alone granted them safety as they marched from one green horizon to another, their low, rumbling calls echoing through the mist. Alongside them, stegosaurs wandered through the undergrowth, their bodies covered in bony plates and spikes, their tiny heads low to the ground as they browsed on ferns and cycads. Though they looked defensive, almost armored, they were peaceful, slow, methodical in the way they moved and fed. They lived in a world where might was not measured by aggression, but by the ability to endure, to graze, to move forward in great, unwavering groups. Above, the forests rustled with the movement of smaller, faster dinosaurs, bipedal hunters with sharp claws and clever eyes. Creatures like Ceratosaurus, with its horned snout and toothy grin, stalked through shadows in search of the weak or the careless. Yet even these predators lived within the balance, rarely risking the wrath of the enormous sauropods, instead focusing on smaller prey or the young, the fallen, the vulnerable. The skies, too, were changing. The air was warmer and more buoyant, and for the first time in Earth's history, vertebrates had truly taken to the air. Pterosaurs, not dinosaurs themselves but close relatives, soared above the landscape with leathery wings stretched between elongated fingers. Some were small and insect-like, flitting from tree to tree, while others grew to wingspans of meters wide, gliding effortlessly across coastal winds and inland thermals. Their cries rang over cliffs and swamps as they nested in colonies along rocky outcrops and riverbanks, laying eggs in hidden crevices and caring for their fragile young. From above, they watched the world below shift and grow, a planet teeming with energy and movement. In this rich, vibrant era, Dinosaurs were no longer rare or remarkable. They were everywhere. In every corner of the land, from humid lowlands to highland forests, they walked, grazed, hunted, and raised their young. Some traveled in tightly knit family groups. Others gathered in massive herds that stretched across the horizon, moving in seasonal patterns from one food source to the next. They communicated through sound, through posture, through scent and touch. Their lives were not so different from the animals of today. There was birth, growth, struggle, and death, but all on a scale the earth had never seen before. Yet not all was peace. As life thrived, competition grew fiercer. The environment pushed species to adapt or vanish. Some dinosaurs developed better vision, sharper claws, stronger limbs. Others grew more armored, more social, more specialized. Evolution was always at work, shaping, refining, experimenting. Every creature was a living record of survival, every bone a story of countless generations. And somewhere among them, in small, feathered forms darting through the branches or stalking insects in the brush, were the early hints of what would eventually become birds. They were small, nimble, almost unnoticeable among their larger cousins, but their wings were already forming, their feathers already serving purposes beyond flight insulation, display, protection. The path to the skies had begun, quietly and without fanfare. The Jurassic world pulsed with ancient rhythms. The mornings were heavy with dew and birdsong. The afternoons buzzed with life as herds grazed and predators stalked. Evenings brought long shadows stretching over ancient lakes, with the deep, distant sounds of creatures calling out across the plains. And as night fell, a calm settled over the land. Stars filled the sky just as they do now, blinking silently over a world that had no names for them. The earth breathed, alive and lush, spinning ever forward. The dinosaurs had found their golden age, a time of abundance, of dominance, of peace and peril in equal measure. And yet, this too would pass. But for now, in this chapter of deep time, they reigned not as monsters, but as rulers of a thriving world, each day a step further into a future they could never know. Each night, a continuation of a story written across the bones of time. The world was vast, green, and full of life. As the Jurassic faded and the Cretaceous period unfurled its endless chapters, the dinosaurs not only endured, they transformed into the most awe-inspiring, complex, and dominant creatures the Earth had ever known. It was an age of mastery, when evolution reached deep into its creative well and pulled out creatures of staggering beauty and power. The continents had drifted further apart now, reshaping the world into more familiar outlines. Oceans widened, new coastlines formed. Inland seas flooded through the heart of land masses, dividing habitats and isolating species. And wherever the land could sustain it, dinosaurs flourished. This was their zenith, the golden crown of their long reign. Across the plains and forests of what we now call North America, herds of horned dinosaurs moved in great numbers, grazing on low-lying plants and migrating with the rhythm of the seasons. Triceratops, with its massive frill and 3 sharp facial horns, was among the last and greatest of them. But it had ancestors and cousins all across the Lanceratopsians, with elaborate crests, hooked beaks, and strong, thick legs. Their faces were ornamented not for defense alone, but likely for show, for signaling, for courtship, and social order. Herds could number in the hundreds, a sea of scales and muscle moving together like a single mind. They were vigilant, coordinated, and far from helpless. When threatened, they could turn and form protective rings around their young, horns out, ready to face whatever stalked them from the forest edge. Not far from these herds, ankylosaurs patrolled the underbrush. Short, heavy-set dinosaurs, armored from head to tail in bony plates, like walking fortresses. Their tails ended in massive clubs of bone, capable of shattering the legs of a predator with one precise swing. They did not need to run. They stood their ground. Some grew so heavily armored that even their eyelids were protected by plates. Their footsteps were slow and deliberate, their senses tuned to danger. their survival etched into every ridge and spike of their thick hide. In other parts of the world, duck-billed hadrosaurs rose to prominence, intelligent, social, and highly adaptable. They gathered in family groups, raised their young in nesting colonies, and communicated through a wide range of calls and signals. Some had elaborate crest shallow and strange that may have allowed them to produce deep, resonant sounds that could travel great distances. Their flattened bills allowed them to crop and chew tough vegetation, grinding it down with complex batteries of teeth. They were the grazers of their time, endlessly moving, endlessly feeding, thriving in every corner of the land where plant life could sustain them. But no age of giants would be complete without predators to match them, and in the Cretaceous, the predators reached heights of terror and precision unmatched in Earth's history. Tyrannosaurus rex, one of the most famous and formidable, ruled the northern continents with bone-crushing jaws and an acute sense of smell. It was not a mindless brute, but a highly tuned apex predator, perhaps even a scavenger at times, taking what it needed with efficiency rather than drama. Its eyes faced forward, giving it depth perception. Its teeth, massive and serrated, could crush bone like paper. It was powerful, yes, but also intelligent, with a brain that suggested complex behavior, maybe even social intelligence. It walked with heavy, thunderous steps that echoed across river valleys and forest clearings, and when it hunted, it did so with purpose. In the southern continents, other giants reigned. Spinosaurus, with its elongated skull and towering sail-like spine, haunted river deltas and swampy wetlands, likely feeding on fish with its crocodilian jaws. Giganotosaurus, a sleek and powerful predator, hunted massive sauropods in the forests of what is now South America. And then there were the raptor, smaller, more agile, equipped with sharp claws and likely covered in feathers. Creatures like Velociraptor and Deinonychus, once thought to be scaly killers, are now understood to be more bird-like, more intelligent, perhaps even cooperative in their hunts. Their claws were not just weapons but tools. Their eyes were sharp, their bodies quick, and their behavior potentially more complex than we've ever imagined. Feathers were spreading throughout the dinosaur world now, appearing not only in the ancestors of birds but in many theropods, used for warmth, display, perhaps even gliding or limited flight. The air was filled with color and movement, and though birds had not yet become the avian forms we know today, the line between bird and dinosaur was blurring rapidly. Nesting behavior was increasingly common. Dinosaurs brooded their eggs. Some even cared for their hatchlings. Fossilized nests show rows of eggs laid in perfect circles, with adults perched gently above them, their bones curled in eternal protection. There was more tenderness in this world than we once believed, more family, more bonds, more complexity of behavior than simple survival. And around all of this life, the Earth itself breathed in cycles of growth and upheaval. The climate was still warm, but changes were coming. Sea levels rose and fell. Land bridges formed and vanished. The world was always shifting, and the dinosaurs, adaptable as they were, shifted with it. New species emerged, others vanished. Each region of the world grew its own unique cast of characters, its own dramas and harmonies of life. In some places, herds roamed open grasslands beneath storm-heavy skies. In others, dense forests towered above secret clearings, where small feathered hunters darted between roots and fallen logs. Even in the polar regions of the time, where darkness could last for months, dinosaurs adapted to the cold, moving in seasonal cycles or growing insulating feathers to brave the chill. This was the height of their world, an age not of monsters, but of brilliance and beauty. The earth had never been more alive. The skies swirled with flying reptiles. The forests echoed with the calls of animals whose names we will never know. The rivers teemed with life. And every corner of the land bore the mark of dinosaurs, not just in their bones, but in the shape of the ecosystems they ruled. It was a world of wonder, one forged over hundreds of millions of years, sculpted by extinction and survival, by growth and struggle, by time itself. Every step of a sauropod, every cry of a hunting raptor, every hatchling breaking free from its egg in a carefully dug nest was all part of a story so vast that it humbles the imagination. And though their reign felt eternal, though the earth was theirs in every way, the seeds of change were already planted. In the distance, beyond the forests and floodplains, beyond even the horizon of their understanding, something waited. But for now, the giants still walked, the rulers still reigned, and the earth still belonged, completely, to the dinosaurs. There was a time when the sky was not empty, when it was as alive as the forests and plains below it, filled with beating wings, gliding forms, and shadows that passed over the land like drifting dreams. The Cretaceous skies were no longer the domain of wind alone. They had become a realm in their own right, ruled not by weather or clouds, but by creatures that had mastered the ancient art of flight. While dinosaurs walked the earth in towering herds and hunted in the shadows of the trees, above them soared their Chimpterosaurs, the rulers of the open air, and the early birds, delicate and clever, flitting through the treetops and gliding on warm-up drafts. The age of dinosaurs was not confined to the ground. It extended to the skies, where another drama played out in silence and wind. Pterosaurs had been in the air long before birds, and by the time the Cretaceous reached its golden maturity, they had evolved into an extraordinary array of forms. Some were small, barely the size of a sparrow, nimble and fast, skimming the surface of ancient lakes to snatch insects or small fish. Others were enormous beasts, like Quetzalcoatlus, whose wings stretched wider than any bird known to us today, gliding effortlessly over prehistoric coastlines. Watching the world with keen eyes from heights no land-bound predator could reach. Their wings were not like those of birds, built from feathers and bone, but membranes stretched across elongated fingers, light and strong, guided by instinct and generations of refinement. Some had crests, like sails rising from their heads, colorful perhaps, used for display or balance. Their bodies were lean, their bones almost hollow, and they moved with an elegance that belied their size. Flight, in this world, was not simply a way to move, it was a way to survive, to find food, to escape danger, to seek mates, to explore the world in 3 dimensions. The sky was a refuge and a hunting ground. It was a theater of life, just as diverse and complex as the world below. And among the branches of ancient trees, something even more remarkable was happening. The first true birds had arrived, not just creatures that glided, but animals that flapped and flew with feathers, grown not just for warmth or display, but for the sky itself. Archaeopteryx had come earlier, a transitional form with teeth in its beak and claws on its wings. But now, newer species had taken the idea further. They had stronger breastbones for flight muscles, lighter skeletons, better feathers. They nested, they cared for their young, they watched the world from treetop perches and dove down with precision and grace. Imagine a quiet morning in the Cretaceous mist rising over a dense, leafy forest. The trees are taller than any buildings, their leaves glistening with dew. In the air, the rhythmic beat of wings stirs the silence as small feathered creatures dart from branch to branch, chasing insects or calling to one another with soft, chirping sounds. High above them, a massive pterosaur rides a thermal current, barely needing to flap its wings, scanning the ground for motion, for opportunity. Below, a herd of plant-eating dinosaurs moves slowly through the underbrush, unaware of the eyes watching from above. The air itself is layered with life, from the buzzing of ancient dragonflies to the gliding silhouettes of sky rulers. Feathers, which had first emerged long ago on the bodies of small dinosaurs for insulation or display, had now become something else entirely. Flight had rewired the rules. It had given rise to new ways of living, new methods of survival, and with feathers came color subtle at first, perhaps, but evolving rapidly. Some of these early birds and feathered dinosaurs may have been brightly patterned, using their plumage to attract mates or to hide among the foliage. Others may have shimmered in iridescent hues under the sunlight, catching the eye with flashes of beauty. The forest canopy was no longer silent. It was alive with whistles, chirps, rustling wings, and the constant soft movement of feather against air. But the skies were not only filled with grace and peace. Predators hunted here, too. Small, agile raptors. Many of them feathered themselves climbed trees and launched into sudden attacks. Some species, like Microraptor, had feathers not just on their arms, but on their legs as well, creating four-winged gliders that could leap and coast between branches with deadly efficiency. They hunted smaller birds, lizards, mammals, anything they could catch. The battle for survival had reached the trees and the air, and it was just as fierce there as it was on the ground. No part of the world was untouched by the rhythm of predator and prey, of chase and escape, of hunger and caution. Nests, too, told stories. Many early birds, and even some feathered dinosaurs, built nests in hidden places, using twigs, leaves, and mud. Fossilized nests show rows of eggs carefully arranged, and in some rare cases, the curled-up skeletons of parents still positioned protectively over their clutch, caught in a final moment of care. This was a world where the sky dwellers were not just creatures of instinct, but of behavior and connection. They raised their young, they defended their nests, they remembered where food was found. They learned. Intelligence was stirring, especially in these small, nimble forms. As the Cretaceous world spun forward in time, the sky grew more complex still. Migrations may have begun seasonal journeys, from breeding grounds to feeding areas. The wind carried not just creatures, but the pollen of flowering plants, which had only recently entered the story of life. These plants, unlike the ancient ferns and conifers, produced color and nectar, and with them came insects that pollinated and birds that may have begun feeding on fruit or seeds. The sky, the trees, the very landscape began to shift again, shaped by mutual relationships between species, delicate and interwoven, the early threads of ecosystems that would echo into the modern world. And as day faded into dusk in the Cretaceous world, the sky changed once more. The colors softened, the air cooled, winged silhouettes returned to nests and perches, their calls growing quieter. Stars emerged, familiar constellations over an unfamiliar earth, and even in the dark, some pterosaurs remained aloft, using keen senses to navigate the night. Bats had not yet appeared, but the idea of night flight had already begun. The earth never truly slept, and neither did the sky. This was a time of elegance, of lightness, of motion, a time when the air belonged not to the wind alone, but to the great sails of pterosaurs and the beating wings of early birds. It was a time of invention, of quiet triumphs, of feathers catching the light in silent celebration, of an evolutionary miracle. The sky had become a kingdom, and those who ruled it did so not with force, but with grace. The air was theirs, and for a long, long time, they soared. Beneath the surface of ancient oceans, beyond the crashing waves and salt-laden winds, there thrived a kingdom as vast and strange as any that ever ruled the land or sky. The seas of the Mesozoic era, particularly during the long stretch of the Cretaceous, were filled with life so alien, so awe-inspiring, that it might seem like another planet entirely. The continents above were shifting, splitting apart and drifting into the outlines we recognize today, and in their wake, vast new seas opened between them, shallow, sunlit waters teeming with movement, color, and danger. These oceans, warm and expansive, were not silent blue deserts, but living tapestries of predators and prey, of swirling schools of fish, of coral gardens and seabeds crawling with creatures that had never touched the light of land. Among the most fearsome rulers of this realm were the mosasaur sleek, powerful marine reptiles that patrolled the open waters with grace and speed. They were not dinosaurs, but their cousins, descended from land-dwelling lizards who had returned to the sea, adapting to aquatic life with flippers instead of limbs, tails flattened into perfect rudders, and long, muscular bodies built for the chase. Some species stretched over 50 feet from snout to tail, with jaws lined with backward-curving teeth to hold struggling prey. Their diet was anything they could overpower: fish, birds, turtles, even other marine reptiles. A sudden shadow, a flash of white teeth, and then silence again. They moved with the stillness of ambush, and the power of a torpedo, their eyes always scanning, their senses honed by millions of years beneath the waves. Alongside them, the plesiosaurs glided with haunting elegance. Their bodies were shaped like giant turtles without shells, with wide, rounded torsos and long, sinuous necks that could snake through the water in search of fish. Some, like Elasmosaurus, had necks so long and flexible they could strike in any direction while keeping their bodies still and hidden. Their small heads belied the power and speed with which they could snap up prey. Others, the pliosaurs, had shorter necks but massive jaws, turning their entire skull into a weapon. These were creatures of brutal strength, built to take down larger prey in violent underwater clashes. Yet not everything in the Mesozoic seas was a predator. There were ammonitospiral-shelled relatives of squids and octopuses drifting and pulsing through the water, with tentacles that grasped at smaller life. Their shells, beautifully coiled and often ribbed or patterned, served as both armor and buoyancy aid. They came in countless shapes and sizes, some no bigger than a coin, others larger than a grown human. For millions of years, they thrived in every corner of the ocean, feeding, reproducing, and vanishing in vast numbers during mass extinctions, only to return and diversify again. Alongside them were belemnites, bullet-shaped cephalopods with hard internal shells, and ancient relatives of modern squids and cuttlefish, darting through the water with ink sacs at the ready to flee from threats. The sea floor itself was alive. Crabs scuttled over coral reefs, starfish clung to rocks, and sea urchins nestled in sandy beds. Giant clams opened and shut in rhythmic silence. Schools of armored fish shimmered through beams of sunlight, each turning in unison like a living mirror. Primitive sharks, with long snouts and serrated teeth, circled slowly in deeper waters, while rays, flat and ghostly, stirred up the sand as they hunted crustaceans. The reefs were formed not only by coral, but by strange sponge-like creatures and early rudist clams, building limestone skeletons into massive underwater cities of stone and life. And everywhere, the cycle of life played out, hunting, fleeing, feeding, spawning. Massive turtles the size of rowboats glided through the open ocean, their shells darkened with age, their journeys spanning continents. Ichthyosaurs, though past their prime in the Cretaceous, had once swum through these waters like fish-shaped missiles, giving birth to live young and breathing air like whales. Their distant relatives, the early marine reptiles of the Triassic and Jurassic, had paved the way for this oceanic reign, and though many were now gone, their influence echoed in the shapes and behaviors of the new rulers. The water itself was warm and rich with nutrients, swirling in currents that carried life from one continent to another. Oceanic trenches yawned deep and dark, places where sunlight never reached, and strange, luminous creatures pulsed with internal light. There were creatures with jaws that unhinged, eyes that saw in darkness, and bodies soft enough to survive under crushing pressure. Even here, at the edge of Earth's known world, life persisted, evolved, and flourished. Volcanic vents on the ocean floor bubbled and steamed, surrounded by heat-loving organisms, feeding not on sunlight, but on the chemical-rich gases erupting from the planet's core. These organisms, blind and alien, hinted at life's endless adaptability, its refusal to surrender, even in the harshest conditions. At the surface, the boundaries between sea and air blurred. Flying reptiles skimmed the waves, diving for fish with long, slender jaws and keen eyes. Birds, early and agile, nested on rocky cliffs and darted out over the water to hunt. The cries of pterosaurs echoed across bays and coves, mixing with the splash of breaking waves and the crash of storms that gathered far off on the horizon. Rain fell in heavy sheets, lightning flashed over the sea, and below it all, in the silent blue, the marine reptiles moved like shadows from another time. Night in the Cretaceous ocean was a different world again. The sun dipped below the waves, and darkness took hold, thick and absolute. Bioluminescent creatures blinked to life in the deep. Swarms of glowing plankton danced in the shallows, lighting the wakes of swimming animals like trails of green fire. The darkness was not empty. It pulsed with invisible life, with the hum of sonar-like signals, with the low frequencies of massive swimmers calling to each other across the black. The ocean breathed in slow tides and unseen rhythms, its surface rising and falling like the chest of a sleeping world. This was not a forgotten place, nor a quiet one. It was every bit as wild, as dangerous, as beautiful as the land above. The seas of deep time were kingdoms of their own, complete with giants and hunters, explorers and survivors. And while the dinosaurs reigned on land, the oceans belonged to a different dynastion, just as enduring, just as mighty. Here, beneath the waves, life wrote its own story, line by line, current by current, deep in the endless blue. Change does not always announce itself with thunder. Sometimes it arrives softly, quietly, slipping into the rhythm of the world, so gently that no creature notices until it is too late. In the later chapters of the Cretaceous period, long after dinosaurs had conquered every continent and the skies and seas teemed with life, the Earth began to shift again. Not suddenly, not in a single dramatic moment, but in whisper-subtle changes that built slowly over thousands, even millions, of years. The world that had once felt eternal, filled with towering creatures and endless forests, began to tilt towards something new. But the dinosaurs, magnificent and mighty as they were, could not have known. The continents were still drifting, inch by inch, reshaping the globe and altering the oceans and winds that carried life from place to place. Mountain ranges slowly pushed their way skyward. Inland seas dried and retreated. Volcanoes awakened in scattered fury, spilling ash and gas into the atmosphere. The climate, though still warm, began to fluctuate more than before. Some regions became drier, others wetter. Habitats shifted, food sources changed. Entire ecosystems, so stable for millions of years, began to unravel and reform. Forests, once dominated by conifers, now saw flowering plants spread with increasing speed, their bright petals and sweet nectar inviting new relationships with birds and insects. These flowering plants, known as angiosperms, were transforming the landscape, weaving new threads into the web of life. While many dinosaurs adapted and flourished in these changing environments, others began to vanish from the fossil record, their time fading like old footprints in soft earth. The seas, too, were evolving. Some of the great marine reptiles that had ruled the oceans for so long were declining. Mosasaurs remained dominant, but the ichthyosaurs were gone, vanished into extinction, long before the dinosaurs' end. Coral reefs shifted, ocean chemistry changed, and sea levels rose and fell unpredictably. Plankton populations, vital to the food chain, fluctuated in delicate balance. Deep under the waves, changes in temperature and nutrient flow began to ripple upward, affecting fish, predators, and the giants that once seemed invincible. Every thread pulled another. Every loss echoed across land and sea. Yet even as the balance began to tip, the world remained astonishingly alive. Great herds still moved through the forests and plains, their footsteps shaking the ground. Tyrannosaurs still hunted with calculated force. Triceratops still locked horns in dramatic displays of power and dominance. In Asia, new species of raptors and beaked dinosaurs evolved, many covered in feathers and displaying signs of intelligence and complex social behavior. Some dinosaurs were shrinking in size, their bodies more agile, their brains more advanced. These smaller forms would one day survive what others could not, but for now, they lived in the shadow of giants, taking up the overlooked corners of the world. There were still endless lakes reflecting the light of dawn, still pterosaurs soaring in the warm wind, gliding over cliffs and ancient forests. Still nests tucked into hillsides, eggs warming beneath the careful watch of parents. Still skies that darkened with storms and cleared to reveal stars. Still migrations across vast distances, and newborns learning to walk on trembling legs, and ancient trees shedding leaves into rivers that wound slowly through peaceful valleys. Life did not end all at once. It never does. It lingered, beautiful and complete, even as change crept in on every side. Far away, Unseen and unknowable, a new force stirred in the silence of space. A rock, larger than a mountain, spun through the void with indifferent speed. It had no aim, no malice, no purpose. It had existed for millions of years, drifting beyond the gaze of any eye, silent and cold. But its path had shifted, drawn toward a blue planet full of light and life. It moved slowly at first, then faster, pulled by gravity and destiny. But still, on Earth, nothing new. The forests whispered only of wind. The oceans held their secrets. The skies above remained wide and blue, with only a few drifting clouds to mark the passing time. And even as the end approached, the world thrived. The last generation of dinosaurs walked beneath flowering trees. They fed, they nested, they protected their young. They roared in the twilight and drank from cool streams and wandered under starlit skies, unaware that their story was reaching its final chapter. All around them, the pieces were shifting. The Earth's crust trembled with increasing frequency. Temperatures spiked and dropped. Some species quietly vanished, never to be seen again. Others rose to take their place. It was not a single moment, but a cascadilla, long, slow breath before the plunge. If you could stand among them, in those final centuries or decades before the sky fell, you would never guess what was coming. You would see a living world, strong and wild, filled with motion and purpose. You would feel the heat of the sun on ancient stone, hear the cries of birds and the distant thunder of sauropods moving through the trees. You would see no reason to believe it could end. And yet, above it all, the silence of space carried something unthinkable, closer, faster, inevitable. The Earth held its breath, and the world waited, without knowing, for the sky to change. It began with a flicker in the sky, a streak of light that may have gone unnoticed by the creatures below. No one looked up. The herds grazed. The forests whispered with the wind. The rivers carried their slow currents across fertile plains. Nothing in the animal world had any reason to understand what that streak meant, what it carried, or how profoundly it would change everything. The world was full, thriving, alive with sound and scent and motion, unaware that it stood on the edge of a precipice. And above it, through the cold silence of space, the asteroid came. Not fast at first, not loud, but constant. A mountain of rock and iron, traveling at tens of thousands of kilometers an hour, pulled toward Earth by an ancient force. For millions of years, it had wandered in the darkness between planets, drifting without aim. Now, it had a destination. And when it struck, the impact was unlike anything life had ever endured. It slammed into the shallow waters near what we now call the Yucatan Peninsula, hitting the Earth with a force greater than every nuclear bomb humanity would ever create combined. In that single moment, time itself seemed to split. A blinding flash ignited the sky, brighter than the sun, casting shadows across continents. The energy released vaporized rock and water, sending superheated debris high into the atmosphere. A crater over 100 miles wide was carved into the crust in seconds, and waves taller than buildings rolled outward in every direction, smashing into coastlines thousands of miles away. Forests were flattened. Seas boiled. The very air caught fire. The heat wave swept across the land faster than any storm. Everything near the impact was gone instantly, reduced to ash. Further away, animals fled, but there was nowhere to run. Fires spread across entire continents. Trees exploded from the inside as sap turned to steam. Even creatures far from the impact felt the earth tremble, the air grow thick and hot, the skies darken. Within hours, the planet had changed. Within days, it was almost unrecognizable. The debris thrown into the sky didn't simply fall back down. Much of it stayed aloft, forming a dense layer of dust and soot that wrapped around the earth like a veil. Sunlight, once the giver of warmth and life, was blocked out. Temperatures dropped. Photosynthesis slowed and then ceased altogether. Plants began to die. With no plants, the herbivores grew weak. With no herbivores, the carnivores followed. A long, freezing night fell over the earth not just for days, but for months, perhaps years. Ash rained down. Acidic clouds formed, falling as poisonous rain. The oceans, too, felt the blow. The sudden cooling, the chemical changes, the collapse of food chains in the plankton-filled waters. Coral reefs bleached and withered. Marine reptiles, already vulnerable, could not survive the changing conditions. The surface world fared no better. The dinosaurs, those creatures who had ruled the planet for over 150 million years, found themselves at the mercy of a world no longer built for them. In the weeks that followed, silence spread. The great herds vanished. The sky no longer echoed with the calls of flying reptiles. Forests fell quiet, their canopies choked with ash. The last roars of tyrannosaurs faded into the wind. There were survivors, yes, creatures, small enough to hide, to burrow, to wait. But the age of giants was over. The mighty had fallen not through war or failure, but through the cold indifference of cosmic chance. And yet, even amid the destruction, life held on. Tiny mammals, already clever and adaptable, curled into underground nests. Insects persisted, feeding on decay. Seeds lay dormant beneath the ash, waiting for the light to return. And birds, the feathered descendants of the very dinosaurs now gone, took refuge in trees that withstood the fire, in regions spared the worst. They carried with them a legacy, the final thread of an empire undone by flame and shadow. Eventually, slowly, the skies began to clear. The ash settled, the sun returned, weaker at first, then stronger. But the world it shone upon was no longer the same. It was quieter, emptier, raw. It bore the scars of impact craters, fossilized forests, layers of soot embedded in stone. But life, ever persistent, began to grow again. Green shoots emerged through grey soil. Insects pollinated flowers once more. Mammals emerged from hiding, and birds sang, not the songs of dinosaurs, but echoes of them, transformed and carried forward. What ended that day was not just a species or a group of animals, but an entire way of life. The world, the dinosaurs built the ecosystems they shaped. The balance they maintained had been swept away. In its place, something new would rise. But the memory of that time remains, written in the rocks, etched into the earth, told through bones found buried under millennia of dust. The fall of the dinosaurs was not just a moment of loss. It was the end of an era, a pause in the great symphony of life, a silence after the thunder. When the fires had burned out, when the skies began to clear, and the ash drifted down like the last snow of a dying world, a quiet began to settle over the earth. It was not the silence of emptiness, not quite. It was the hush of survival. The world had changed, violently and permanently, but in the wreckage, life endured. Small, trembling, almost invisible in the vastness of what had been lost, survivors crept from shadows and burrows, blinking at a sun that had finally returned, weak and pale but warm again. These were not the towering giants of old. These were not the thunder-footed herds or the terrible hunters that once ruled. The great age of dinosaurs had ended, not with a single death, but with a collapse so wide and final that the world had to start over. And it did. Life never truly disappears. It bends, it adapts, it waits. Among the earliest creatures to stir in this new world were mammals, tiny, scurrying things that had lived in the corners of the dinosaur world, rarely noticed, always hiding. They had fur to keep them warm in the dark and cold. They had sharp senses and flexible diets. They bore live young and cared for them, taught them to navigate danger and scarcity. When the great extinction swept across the planet, these traits became not just useful, but vital. They curled into tight balls underground or inside fallen logs. They ate what they could, roots, insects, anything that remained, and they waited. Through the long nights, through the storms and soot-filled rains, they waited. And when the light returned, they were ready. Slowly, cautiously, they spread. Their paws touched ash and blackened earth. Their noses twitched at new scent-scorched plants beginning to regrow, insects returning, fungi breaking down the remains of what had come before. They moved through landscapes that no longer echoed with the sounds of dinosaurs, only with wind and the distant calls of birds. These birds, too, were survivors, not the massive, toothed beasts of the past, but smaller, lighter descendants who had taken to the trees and air with unmatched adaptability. Their feathers, once evolved for warmth and display, had become lifelines. Their hollow bones made flight possible. Their songs, faint at first, began to fill the quiet. The forests, once broken and burned, began to return. First came the ferns, spreading like green lace across the barren ground. Then the flowering plants, which had already begun their quiet revolution in the final chapters of the Cretaceous, now flourished like never before. Their colors, scents, and nectar called to insects, and those insects in turn fed the birds and mammals that needed them to survive. A new web of life was beginning to form, fragile, beautiful, entirely different from what had come before, and at its heart were the creatures that had once been background characters in a world of titans. Evolution did not stop. It never does. It pressed forward, slowly shaping new forms from the survivors. Mammals grew larger. Some adapted to the trees, others to the open plains, still others to the water. They became grazers, hunters, climbers, diggers. They filled the spaces left behind by the vanished dinosaurs, though nothing could ever truly replace them. The age of mammals had begun not as a sudden ascension, but as a long, gradual unfolding, a story written not in speed or size, but in endurance. And still, the birds flew, their beaks and claws diversified, their feathers took on new shapes and functions. Some grew into flightless forms and began to reclaim the ground. Others remained in the skies, learning to sing, to migrate, to dance in air currents, just as their ancestors had once ruled the canopy and cliffs. They were a living bridge between the past and the present-silent reminders that not all had been lost. In their bones, in their blood, in the way they cared for their eggs and guarded their young, the spirit of the dinosaurs remained. Deep in the soil, the record of the past was being preserved. Layers of ash and rock told the story of the end. Fossils, left behind by creatures that once shook the earth with every step, slept in stone, waiting to be found, and above them, the new world continued to grow. Seasons returned. Rain came more gently. Rivers ran clear again. The air lost its bitterness, and though much had changed, life was still writing its story, one generation at a time. In time, the descendants of those early mammals would walk upright. They would shape tools, build shelters, ask questions. They would look up at the stars and wonder how everything began. They would find the bones of the ancient world buried beneath their feet and realize, with awe, that they were part of the same story, that the earth had once belonged to giants, that those giants had fallen, that from the silence, life had begun again. The survivors of the great extinction did not rise in glory. They rose in shadows and patience, in resilience and quiet transformation, and from their endurance came everything that followed. The forests, the birdsong, the flowers, the creatures that roam today. In every heartbeat of a mammal, in every wingbeat of a bird, there is a trace of what came before, a legacy not of dominance, but of survival, a soft, steady echo of a world that once thundered with giants. Now, as the deep night embraces the world, and your breathing slows in rhythm with the quiet pulse of the earth, imagine that beneath your feet lie ancient secret remnants of a time so distant it feels like a dream. Beneath deserts, beneath mountains, beneath cities and forests, lie the bones of creatures that once ruled this planet with a majesty unmatched. These bones, long buried beneath layers of stone and dust, are silent storytellers, whispering tales of a world that was both fierce and beautiful. A world where titans walked beneath a sky full of strange stars, where creatures of unimaginable size grazed peacefully, hunted stealthily, and soared silently. These echoes of the past are more than just fossils. They are the footprints of history, the shadows of the sleepy centuries. Picture a fossil bed, a patch of earth where time itself seems to have stopped, where bones lie arranged in long-forgotten patterns. The delicate shape of a bird's feather, preserved perfectly in stone, a silent reminder of wings that once beat against Jurassic skies. The curved claw of a raptor, sharp and deadly, frozen in eternal readiness, the massive vertebrae of a long-necked sauropod, stacked like the columns of a forgotten temple. In these relics, life's story is etched not just the grandeur of the giants, but the subtle details of their existence, the care they showed their young, the injuries they survived, the struggles written in fractures and regrowth. These are stories told in bone, in stone, in the quiet language of time. Now imagine yourself walking softly through an ancient forest, the air cool and heavy with the scent of moss and earth. The leaves rustle gently, and somewhere in the distance, a small bird sings a living link to the past, carrying the legacy of feathers and flight. Around you, the trees stand tall and strong, their roots deep in the soil that cradles countless generations. You step carefully, mindful of the life beneath the leaf, litter the insects, the small mammals, the delicate ferns that trace patterns in green. This is a world of continuity, where the past and present weave together in seamless harmony. As you settle deeper into sleep, your mind travels back through the sleepy centuries, tracing the slow dance of evolution and extinction. You feel the steady pulse of the earth, the soft thrum of life, emerging from the quiet shadows. The dinosaurs may have walked the earth millions of years ago, but their spirit remains in the birds that sing at dawn, in the patterns of scales and feathers, in the bones that speak of strength and survival. Their story is not just about endings, but beginnings, about change and resilience, about the endless flow of time. The stars above shine with the same ancient light that once illuminated dinosaur skies. They remind us that time is vast, endless, and mysterious. The earth turns quietly beneath those stars, carrying memories and hopes alike. And now, as you drift further into the gentle embrace of sleep, you carry those memories with you, the echoes of giants, the whispers of ancient forests, the songs of feathered skies. Let yourself float in the calm of this timeless night, where every breath is a connection to the vastness of life's journey. Rest now, traveler of time, wrapped in the soft shadow of the sleepy centuries. Dream of worlds long gone and those yet to come. Sleep deeply, knowing that beneath your dreams lies the heartbeat of a planet that has seen endless cycles of life and rest. The story continues, silent and sure, beneath the surface of all things. Good night.